Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello everybody. Welcome to episode 21 already, which is quite a nice number. So I'm happy that the show is still going. And I want to thank all of you for listening to begin with. Now, first things first, what are we going to talk about today? Well, I'll do a little bit of an intro on what's new, and then I'm going to talk about martial arts as systems or self-defense systems as systems, which will make sense in a little bit, so bear with me. But before we get started, a quick shout out to one of my patrons, Andy Benfield, who has been a very staunch supporter of not only the podcast, but also all my other work. So I want to, say big thanks to him for everything he's done to support me throughout the years. And this is also a feature which will come back regularly on the following episodes of the podcast, where I'm just going to be a little bit of a nice guy, which every now and then I manage to do, and just say thanks to the people who support me. So that's the first one. Andy, thanks, man. Now, if you want to support the podcast, obviously you are always welcome. Just go to patreon.com/Wim Demeere, my name. And then you'll get to my Patreon page, where you will see all the fun and interesting stuff that we've got going there. I've got a really cool update on that, which I'll talk to you guys about in a minute. Now, that's it. Next for what's going on. Just as late as yesterday, I finally managed to, I hope, fix all my problems with the software. It took another round of spending hours with the help desk, and it was just horrible. You don't want to know. But it looks, knock on wood, that everything is fixed more or less and more or less stable also. So I can start inviting guests again for the podcast, which I'm very happy about, because this has been several, almost 2 months now of just the hell on earth getting my computer to work correctly again. So that I can record the guests correctly, because the quality was so crap that it was just impossible to do decent interviews. So I hope to get that started up as quickly as possible. And if I can line up my guests correctly, then I will release the interviews week after week, as opposed to the normal schedule, which is every 2 weeks. So I'll try to catch up a little bit the lost time, and then obviously start to get some more guests into the show. Now, as always, if you have ideas for people you'd like me to interview, let me know. Just go to my blog, wimsblog.com, and you can comment on the podcast episode that this one here is. Now, the URL for that is wimsblog.com/21, so 2021, the numbers, wimsblog.com/21, and then you get to my blog, where you will see all the show notes for one, and just leave a comment there and let me know, okay, I've got a good idea about a guest I'd like you to talk about, because sounds like an interesting person. So always open to that, or you can hit me up on social media, that's fine. Whatever, just let me know. So that is the first good news. Now, moving on to what I just wanted to mention. I've been trying something new on Patreon, and it's been a lot of fun so far, just in the beginning stages, but I think there's a lot more to come. Now, how should I put this? I've got a bunch of friends that I talk to mostly via email or via chat sessions and so on. They're quite interesting people who have a wealth of experience, and one of them is Jerry. We've been friends for a very, very long time, and we've talked all over the place, basically in private, about martial arts, self-defense, and so on. This just happened out of the blue, just by accident, that he made a comment about something, and we got talking again about it, and it was about sword fighting and the geometry involved, which you see a lot about when you look at the old Western fencing and other martial manuals that are still available, that you can still find nowadays. And there's a lot of people who are trying to recreate the old martial arts that we had in Europe, basically, in the Middle Ages and later on and so on. So we're not going to really talk about, necessarily the, how should I put it, the specifics of, well, this is how you use a broadsword and so on. So we're just mainly going to focus on the geometry and how different kinds of manuals can be interpreted, or at least the content that is found in there. Now, why am I doing that on Patreon? Well, it was just a way for us to basically share a little bit of some of the private conversations that we have, where we talk about a lot of stuff. And I basically realized that, well, I've never really shared this kind of stuff with other people, and Jerry was up for it. So we're going to basically go through a discussion that we would normally have, and then obviously my patrons can add questions. Now, to give you a little bit of a background, Jerry's a medieval studies major, and I asked him just to make sure that I got it right. So he had a split focus on medieval literature, English literature, and scholastic philosophy. He also worked as a research assistant for two professors of medieval philosophy, and that obviously gave him a lot of insight in how to research historical documents, which is a very, very different kind of training than most martial artists have who try this kind of stuff. So that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to have him on board in this whole venture of us talking about that. Now, what are we going to do? Well, what are we already doing? It's looking at how the geometry of sword fighting that's very often used in those old manuscripts, how it works in a practical sense. And that was always one of my things when he talked to me about that, is that it wasn't practical. There was a lot of things that I didn't understand, because the definitions, the way that some people described them, didn't make any sense. There were pieces missing, or I didn't see how it translated into actual fighting or self-defense. And we talked about that many times over the years. So, and our goal is now to look at it a little bit more, and how you can use swords, sticks, knives, and so on, how that relates also to empty hand self-defense, and make it work as a system of basically analyzing violence on a technical and tactical level, and then obviously trying to get more proficient at defending yourself. So the goal isn't really to recreate medieval sword fighting. That is not what we're doing. What we're doing is looking at the theory behind it, how the theory behind it works, and then obviously how you can apply that to modern day self-defense. That's the whole point, because we don't live in the Middle Ages anymore. We're living in a very modern age. So how does that apply to what we're doing today? I think that's going to be a fun discussion. It's been quite interesting so far, and I hope my patrons enjoy it. If you want to join us, this is available on my Patreon page at all levels. So patreon.com/Demeere, and join us there. So that's it for the intro. Now we can move on to the main topic. How should I put that? This martial arts systems, and or viewing martial arts as systems, is what I want to talk about nowadays. A little bit more than before, because it's something that's been on my mind, let's say maybe the last 10 years. The more that I teach, the more that I practice, the more that I'm looking at it from a different perspective than from when I was a beginning student many, many years ago. It's a little bit difficult to explain this in a short sentence. I'm not going to do an elevator pitch. I hate elevator pitches to begin with. I think it's a fraudulent way of putting things forward, but that's a whole different story. Now, what I am going to do is try to give you an overview, and that's why it's difficult to work with this kind of concept, because you need to be able to put all the pieces on the table first, and then explain how they work together to help, so that the person who's listening to you can actually make sense of it, which is the essence of a system. Before we start, so let's find the definition first. So what is a system? I looked it up, and what I got was a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism or an connecting network, a complex whole, or a set of principles or procedures according to which something is done, an organized scheme or method. So that is a system. My point is that specific martial arts should, or at the very least can, be viewed as systems, not necessarily styles, but systems. Before I go on with that, now there's a really interesting book that I read many years ago, and it's called Thinking in Systems, a Primer. And I'll put a link in the show notes so you can go there and find it. And in that book, it's a really good way it's a good introduction of how to think in systems and how it applies to, well, I wouldn't say everything, but quite a lot. The whole point is that when you look at something as a system, very often it explains why just changing a single aspect or a single component of the system doesn't necessarily yield the results that you want. And this applies to large, complex problems in society, but also in your personal life. So that is why I thought it was such an interesting book and why I wanted to talk to you guys about this a little bit today. Moving on to the first analogy that I'm going to use, and I think it's a good one. I've been using it with my students for a very long time. They're probably tired of me talking about that. But if you want to understand what a system is as far as martial arts or self-defense goes, think of something you know already. So let's look at your computer, and I do hope you're not a Mac user, but let's look at Windows. Windows is the operating system of your laptop or desktop or whatever. Again, if you're a Mac guy, if you're an Apple guy, the same applies to you, but I'm a Windows guy. My apologies for that if that offends you or if you find it difficult to comprehend, but that's what I use. So that's what I'm going to use to explain this to you. How do you make the Windows operating system? Well, you have to code it first. Somebody has to program all that stuff. So it has a source code. So that main code is how the program is written. And all the essential elements that will make Windows a system are in there. So that's the DNA, so to speak. Again, this is an analogy. So you will always find ways to break down an analogy if you pull at it, hard enough. If you cut it up into, more than a little bit of, if you cut it up into too many pieces, it breaks down. So bear with me. It's just an analogy. It's nothing more. So let's say that the source code of Windows, let's compare that to the human body when it comes to martial arts. So there's much more similarities in the different kinds of human bodies we have as human beings, as opposed to the differences. Sure, there are differences, but there's a lot more similar. So let's say that the source code for most people is pretty much the same, more or less, barring obviously exceptions, barring people who are born with certain genetic problems or having just giving an extreme example, but if you're born with a really bad back, well, that's going to limit certain things that you can do. If you are born with, as a friend of mine is, with your knees basically inverted, that's going to make obviously a huge difference in what you can do. So all sorts of exceptions, but let's stick to the general rule, which would be our human body is more or less the same consistently throughout all humanity. Next part, what you see then is Windows is done. The programmers have finished typing in all the source code and everything is working. So you boot it up, Windows starts, and you see your screen on your monitor or on the screen of your laptop. Well, you're not doing anything. The only thing that Windows did was it started, it began. But before you open a program, what I'd like you to do is hit Control-Alt-Delete, which you should know how that works. And that's going to open the task manager. Now in the task manager, you can take a look at all the stuff that is going on in the background. And you'll notice that there's dozens of processes that are running in the background. That are all small components that make Windows work. Now, they're all there for different reasons. Some of you might argue that there's too much of those processes running around. I'm not going to go into that, but the point is that there's a lot of stuff going on in the background that you're not really thinking about when you work with Windows. At a very basic level, if you compare this to martial arts as a system, this would mean things like coordination, balance, timing, and so on. So all things that you need those to be able to defend yourself, to use your techniques. But it's not something that you can actually take the time to think about when you're fighting. Now you can break all this stuff down into specific drills and techniques and so on. And for training, this is a good idea. You need to do that. But when the fight is on, you have no time to think about, well, is my balance okay? So if I take a big step to the left now, how will this affect my balance? And if I move now or I wait a fraction of a second later, is my timing still going to be okay or not? There's no time for that. All that stuff needs to be covered in training. all that stuff needs to be ingrained in training already before the fight is on. So that's why I use the analogy of a background process, is that you need to program that in, and it is running as you start up Windows, but nobody is looking at all those background processes. That's not the goal. The goal is to be able to use Windows. Well, the goal is to be able to defend yourself correctly and not have to think about certain things. That needs to be ingrained. Again, basic analogy. Moving on to the next part. So we've got Windows running, the background processes are running as well. So what is there next? Well, now you can finally start to use your computer. And then you open a program. That could be your word processor, it could be a spreadsheet, it could be your web browser, and so on, doesn't matter. But you open a program to do something specific. Again, using that analogy with martial arts, these programs would be things like your kicking skills, punching, clinching, grappling, throwing, and so on. So all the specific techniques that you can fit into a specific category. Now, I don't view these as individual techniques, though you can, and when you train, you should perhaps, but I view them as skill sets, the skill of kicking, the skill of punching. And that skill is comprised of many different components. There's straight punches, there's hook punches, there's uppercuts, there's so on, a bunch more, but they all fit into that category of punching. That is what I would call a program. And then the whole point is that you can use that program and learn how to use it correctly to achieve whatever goal you have. So backing up a little bit, so you've got Windows that you're going to use as a system, source code, processes in the background as soon as you run it, and then you use a program to actually do something with it. Now, that is one way of comparing martial arts to a system that you are already familiar with. What I would like to do now is look a little bit at how martial arts systems are constructed. What are some of the important components and elements that are involved there? So first things first, there's the physical aspect. So that would be speed, strength, coordination, conditioning, and so on. Many different ways that you can look at this, but in the Chinese martial arts, they call this Shenfa, which you could translate roughly into body method, or what is more commonly used in the West is body mechanics. That is, how specifically do you move your body to do the things you need to do in that martial art. Now, if you want to have a comparison, watch a Western boxer throw a right straight punch. Then watch a Shotokan karate guy throwing a right straight punch. Then watch a Muay Thai fighter throw a right straight punch. And then you watch, let's say, a Pencak Silat practitioner throw a right straight punch. You'll see a large variety of techniques, but if you go beyond the technique, the way that they use their body to throw that same technique is going to be different. The Shotokan guy will probably be in a much lower stance than the Muay Thai guy, who will probably be mostly upright. And when you look at the way that he stands and you compare it to that Shotokan guy who's in that deep front stance, you might think, well, that Muay Thai guy, he's going to be easy to break his balance, because look at how high he's standing. And that would be a rude surprise probably if you try that the first time, if you haven't encountered what these guys can do. And that brings us to body method. Obviously, the Muay Thai guy also knows that he's likely to be a little bit more off balance. So they have a very specific way of throwing that right straight punch so that they are actually more stable than you would think if you just look at the height of his stance and compare it to the Shotokan practitioner who's in that much lower stance. So that would be all attributed to the body mechanics. Now, body mechanics, there are a lot more is involved with that, but that would be the first part. So when you look at a system, look at how they use their body. And this is a point where we're getting to something that I've talked about many times in the past, and that is what I call Randy's Law. I'm not going to start up with Randy's Law completely and explain everything. What I will do is point you to an article that I wrote on my blog a while ago about this. And in that article, what I did is explain what Randy's Law is and why it applies and why I think it's so fundamentally important for your practice. Now, if you don't know Rani's law, it is the the differences are just as important as the similarities. The differences are just as important as the similarities. So, and that's why I like you to look at different martial arts and just look at the way they move their body beyond just a simple technique. You'll find a lot of interesting things there. Now, a different component of systems is obviously technical, it's techniques. For instance, Taekwondo has a lot of kicking techniques, boxing does not. Now, systems will have an emphasis on specific techniques, and another system will specialize in something completely different, just like the two examples that I gave you. So that also obviously has an influence on everything. Is where, technically speaking, does the system specialize in, or how much time does it spend on certain things and not as much on something else. Moving on to the next component, that would be tactical. What does your art like to do? For instance, in the Tai Chi Chuan that I teach, we like to either evade an attack by moving the target that the opponent is going for. So he's punching at my head, I'll move my head. The second thing we try to do is diverting that incoming attack away from us. If I can, for instance, parry it out of the way with my hand, that would be even better. And the third part is that we like to use footwork to get our whole body out of the way. And that would mean me stepping offline. Now, if at all possible, I'll do all three things together. So these are very specific tactics, and they flow from the next component, which is obviously strategy. So when you look at a martial art as a system, look at the tactics that they employ. If you are, for instance, a practitioner of judo, you're going to have to get close enough to grab the guy. You might have to figure out how to do that, but you're gonna have to move into range and grab the guy. Well, tactically speaking, how you do that? Well, you can look at that. So when you look at different martial arts, the tactical principles, the tactics used to apply the techniques are very, very different one from the other art. So that is a key component when you look at systems. Now, obviously, like I said, this brings us to the next component, which is strategy. And strategy is more, what is the overall plan? So what is the overarching plan and way of going about things? So once again, looking at my own style, we have a preference for counterattacking. We like the opponent to commit to an attack and then use it against him. Now, that doesn't mean we never strike first. We do that too. But overall, our strategy is to try to counter the opponent when he commits to a specific attack, and then use his strength, his energy, his speed against him, if at all possible. So that's a very, very specific strategy. And that is in complete contrast with the Kun Tao that I learned from the late Bob Orlando, my teacher. And he had a very aggressive style. So his Kun Tao was very, very aggressive. And he would say, attack, attack, attack. He was always attacking. So yes, there was blocking and countering, obviously, but he was extremely aggressive. Whereas Tai Chi Chuan, for instance, that I practice, has the ability to both control or to injure and harm and basically be extremely nasty. So the overall strategy is going to have a huge influence on how your system actually functions. So take a look at your own system. So what's the overall plan? What's the overarching strategy in your style? Moving on to the next part, and this is a little bit tricky because people often get a little bit upset when I mention it, but is your art mainly focusing on dueling or on self-defense? Is it focused on one-on-one combat, or does it take into account the realities of, for instance, multiple opponents? Give you an example. I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is mainly a dueling system with a very specific focus, fighting on the ground. And it excels at that. It's very good at that. However, when you add in, for instance, multiple opponents, what makes it so good for ground fighting is actually creating many weaknesses when it comes to the realities of self-defense, which is, in this case, multiple opponents, weapons, environment, and so on. So I know that this is sometimes a little bit hard to swallow if you're a BJJ practitioner. No disrespect meant, but it's one of the realities that I think we all have to face, is that whatever art we practice and love, it's not going to be great at everything that is out there, including everything I do. There's limitations to all the arts that I love and practice. I think it applies to everything. So it's not something to get upset about, but I notice that happens anyway. That's why I mention it. So that automatically brings us to the next component of a system, which is all too often overlooked and misinterpreted. And that is, are you practicing a combat sport or a self-defense system? Because there's a huge difference. Again, the differences are just as important as the similarities. Now, no matter how hard the combat sport that you practice is, and this is me talking as a mixed martial arts teacher and coach, no matter how hard the combat sport that you practice is, it's still a sport. There are still rules, there's fouls, there's referees. When you fight, there's an agreed upon time and date of the fight. You can get ready, you can psych yourself up. There's no surprise factor. There's no weapons allowed. His friends can't jump you from behind and intervene. All that stuff is out the window. So it's very hard, but it's still a combat sports system as opposed to purely self-defense, in which a bunch of other factors that are never, ever an issue in, for instance, MMA, they're never an issue there. Well, they come into play when it comes to self-defense. For instance, the assumption that a weapon will be in play, or that a weapon is likely to be pulled at whatever stage of the fight you're in. That is a basic assumption for an effective self-defense system. If you assume the opponent is armed, well, when he actually pulls that weapon, you have a better shot than not only assuming, but knowing that he's never going to be armed, as is the case in an MMA fight. Look at any of the UFC or Bellator fights, there's no weapons allowed. The guys are checked for weapons, they're not allowed to have weapons. So the way you train is the way you fight is one of the maxims in martial arts and combat sports. What if you never ever train to handle weapons? How do you expect to, out of the blue, suddenly be able to do that when the need is there? Doesn't mean you can't fight, doesn't mean you can't defend yourself. What it means is that you're not preparing specifically for that situation. And why would you? It's a combat sport in which weapons are not allowed, so why would you? It would be silly to practice that. Again, this is me talking as an MMA coach, so I have nothing bad to say about MMA as a combat sport. But again, we have to see the limitations that are there, even if that makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. So moving on to another component, which I think is perhaps the most important one, is what is the teaching approach? What is taught, and at which stage in the evolution of a student is it done? How is it taught? What is the sequence, and so on? So how the teaching method that is used is put together in a system, that will determine how the system functions to a large degree. For instance, I'm using the Tai Chi style that I teach because it's the example that I know very well, and I've talked about it before, so people will understand this maybe a little bit better. When a new student comes in, we start with basic footwork, basic defensive techniques, and attacking and counter-attacking techniques, very basic stuff. Now, as the student progresses, he needs to improve his body mechanics in a very, very specific way. And this, in turn, is allowing him, when he gets to a level of competency, to perform these same movements he learned in the first classes, and at the same techniques he learned at the beginning, but in a much more effective way. And some of the skills that you can find at the higher levels, and I don't like to use the term higher, but it makes sense. You understand better if I do. Some of the skills that you find at the higher levels can only be attained if you go through the process of learning everything correctly. So the process is just as important as the end result, because it's the process of learning things in a very specific way, in a specific order, so that they build upon themselves. That is what allows you to get certain skills, as opposed to trying to get that skill you see an advanced student to try to get that right away. It's not just the skill that is important, it's how you get to that skill. And this tends to take quite a bit of time to get there. And in the meantime, obviously, you should be able to defend yourself, which is where you focus on the basic, simple things in the beginning when you start. But the whole idea is that you refine them over time to get to those so-called higher levels. And that teaching approach is very different in each art. It's extremely different from one art to the next. And some people focus immediately on going hard and sparring and fighting and so on. And others spend a lot of time on basic technical competence, and there's no sparring allowed until they do that. And then those are two extremes on opposite sides of the scale. There's a lot of middle ground, how different styles teach that. But my point is that the way that you learn a system, the way that it is taught, the way that it is brought to you piecemeal wise, so that you learn something and then you learn something else. If that is done correctly, then everything you learn is going to be a foundation for the next thing you learn. And there's ways of messing this up so you end up basically in a dead-end street in your training if this isn't done correctly. Because things you learn, for instance, in sparring, if you spar too early, what often happens is that you instinctively start to flinch and have certain reactions, certain technical errors that you make automatically because you're not ready for that level of intensity. And these then tend to be ingrained. And we know now that the brain remembers and stores in its memory things differently under adrenal stress than it does when you're just practicing in front of the mirror, or even when you're training with a partner at a relatively high intensity. As soon as there's real punching and kicking at you in a very chaotic environment like sparring, especially if you spar hard, well, it's going to have an effect. Even if you don't like it, even if you think it doesn't have to be this way, or you don't want it to be, you're still going to ingrain stuff at a very deep core level. So that is why the incremental approach is actually quite interesting, because the point of it is that you should be able to think of the long term as opposed to the short term. And I'll get back to that in a minute. I'll give you an example. In a Tai Chi Chuan style that I practice, there's a technique called single whip. That technique can be done at many different levels. And one of the ways that you can apply it is against, there's a straight punch coming at you, you get out the way and you hit the guy back. Now, at the beginning level, when a student is new, what I will ask him to do is try to step offline, move his head out of the way of the punch, try to deflect that punch a little bit out of the way. Doesn't really matter how he does that, but I just want to have his hand between, or his forearm between the striking arm of the attacker and his face. There needs to be a shield somewhere in there. And as soon as he has done that, he needs to use his other hand to hit the opponent in the head. That is the technique, single whip. Now that is a very basic technique, the beginning of how you can actually make it work, even if you're not very skilled in the style, even if you don't know a lot. So that is the first step. Now, the next step, when you have a little bit more skill and more training and other pieces have fallen into place, then you will actually start to time it in such a way so that the deflection and the strike become the same movement. So you strike as you deflect that incoming punch. And then you train some more and you get better at that. And then you will try to deflect it in such a way that the harder he punches, the more stable you become, and the more he actually almost bounces off your arm or your forearm as you deflect that. So he loses his balance as you do your technique. And then you train some more. Now, one of the things that you also need to do, that you also can do as you do the technique, is grab his wrist at the end of the punch, not in the middle, not as he's going full speed, but after you've slowed down his punch sufficiently, and before he can retract that, then you grab his wrist, and obviously still strike him at the same time. So that makes sure that he can't use that arm against you, and you can do all sorts of joint locks and other fun techniques with his arm that you just captured. But that kind of timing is tricky. It takes a while to get that, so that's why it comes in a later phase. And then still in a later phase, what you would do is as you grab that wrist, you will grab it not just in a general way, but in a very specific way, so that you use your fingertips to close one of the arteries in one of the major blood vessels in his wrist. So that it has a very specific effect if you do it correctly on the way that his brain functions. So you could call that one of the Demeere things or pressure point things. We don't really, well, I don't view it that way. I just view it as an additional layer on top of the technique that is going to cause, hopefully, a specific effect in his body and accentuate the effect of the strike to the head. Now, doing that is extremely difficult, especially under adrenal stress. So that's why it's the last phase of the technique. It's if you can get out of the way in time, if you can deflect, if you can hit the guy in the head, if you can do that at the same time as deflecting, if you can stabilize your position, if there's a lot of ifs involved, only then can you start with the last part. So the whole idea is that the techniques are a progression from something very basic, very simple, that as you train more and more and more, you can add layers of not necessarily difficulty, but complexity on top of that. And as you get better, you are more able to pull these off under adrenal stress. That's the whole point. One of the things we in my opinion, have gone a little bit too far in is viewing adrenal stress as this huge big monster and you will lose all fine motor control and you will have all this. It's not true. Let me put it differently. It's only half of the truth. Yes, that happens. Yes, it happens to many people. Been there, done that. So that's not the issue. However, with sufficient training, with good ingraining, with progressive exposure to adrenal stress, and so on, with live fire experience, and so on, your reactions, it is possible to change them. That you actually don't lose your fine motor control as much. That you can actually do some pretty complex stuff that a lot of people say, well, that's never going to work in a real fight. That is actually quite possible. And there's a bunch of people you can talk to who will tell you, well, I did this. Or that you could see somebody on CCTV or cell phone footage from an actual fight doing some really funky technique that you say, well, I didn't saw that coming because it looks too complex, too difficult, and like, well, this only works in the movies or in the dojo. So that's the whole point of looking at it as a system, is when you see a technique and you see something that is like the last phase of a whole progression of difficulty, and you say, well, this is nonsense, this could never work. Well, okay, well, what are you looking at? Is this a beginner technique, or is this something that assumes that you've gone through that process for a long time, that you've done all the hard work to get there, and that you have the experience to pull it off? Or it could obviously be that it's some sort of McDojo idiot guy who's making up, messed up techniques just to show something on his YouTube channel and get a lot of people to watch him and click on his ads. That could also be the case. But my point is that it gets to be rather complex if you look at well put together systems, at systems that are constructed correctly and that have a long-term plan, as opposed to something that is a relatively recent development where there's still a lot of how should I put it? There's a lot of evolving that the system still has to do. And this is not a knock on those systems. It's just explaining something that the dynamic involved with how martial arts and so on work. Now, I told you I'd get back to that. So what I'd like you to do is, and I'll put a link in the show notes, and it's a book that my former teacher wrote, Bob Orlando. It's called Martial Arts America. And it's an older book, but it has some quite interesting things that he wrote in there. And one of the things he explained there is the evolution and devolution of martial arts, and he saw it as a cycle. Now I'm going to quickly recap, explain how that works without going into too much detail. The point is this: let's say you and I fight, and we've never fought before, we've never trained fighting before, we don't know anything. We start fighting. And during the fight, we figure out, well, this punch didn't work at all, and this punch landed. Okay, I'll do that a couple times. And then I figure out, okay, this big-ass haymaker that I throw with my right hand, that has a lot of power. Interesting. See how that works next time. Lo and behold, next time that I fight, I try that big haymaker with a lot more confidence this time, because I know that it can work. And what do you know? It lands again. And all of a sudden, I've got a valid technique that my experience teaches me, well, this works. And that way, through experience, you develop a set of techniques or tricks, if you like, that you know work. Why? Because you did it, and it worked. There's no denying, there's no argument. You could say that you got lucky, doesn't matter, it still worked. The next stage of the evolution is that you take a bunch of those techniques and you make a system out of them. You try to structure them, to order them, to put them in categories, and see how you can make them all work together better. And then I'll notice that, well, if I throw that big haymaker, I've got my weight on my lead leg, I'll be leaning over that lead leg probably a little bit. So I got to make sure that I'm not off balance. So how can I follow that up? Well, maybe I'll step through with my back leg and then do a double leg takedown, whatever, just making up an example. So you're trying to look at the techniques that you know work and put them together in combinations. How do they interact with each other? How can you use one to get to the next, and so on. So that's a fighting system. The next step of the evolution would be martial arts. And that is when we get to the point where we have a fighting system, but there's a bunch of stuff that gets in there. We start developing forms, because forms are a way of learning something very specific. You start adding things like maybe philosophy, meditation, in some cases even religion. But you add a bunch of stuff that is in there. You start adding martial etiquette. You start adding different types of how do you behave towards your teacher, different codes of conduct, let's say. So there's a bunch of other things that get in there that are not necessarily about fighting techniques per se, but it's grown beyond the stage of a fighting system as well. And then we get to what we call the devolution, the negative part. And that means that, well, the martial art is getting very popular and people want to have fun with it, and they want to compete. People always want to compete. So to compete in a safe manner, obviously we need rules, because we can't just allow people to kill each other. So we add rules, and the rules obviously change the way the techniques are done. Because if you can't do this, you can't do that, and so on, you're going to have to fight a different way than you saw in those fighting systems that we had 2 iterations back. And that is where things break down. Because, as always, the rules of a sport, no matter how harsh the sport is, the rules will always determine the strategies and tactics and the techniques, always. If you have a good memory, look back at the 70s and early 80s, what happened is that we had kickboxing over here, no leg kicks allowed. Well, as soon as they added the leg kick to it, all the guys who were champions without leg kicks, always kicking above the waistline and kicking high, they had a hugely difficult time figuring out how that worked. And I've told this many times, but I remember I was there. I was alive during that time. And I was very interested in martial arts, and I read interviews in the magazines of the very big name American champions in what we call the American kickboxing, again, no leg kicks. And they said, well, I'll just side kick over that low kick, no problem. I stay far away from the guy. Well, you know what? Go look up that kind of stuff on YouTube, see those fights, and see what happened. And long story short, they got beat up bad. So that was one technique. One technique was different. That's just to give you an idea how martial sports can devolve actually what happens in real life, because the rules, the regulations, the context, the setting, and so on. Let's say that you started with a martial sport. That's where you began your training. You never fought outside of the dojo. You've had a great life, no violence, and you start practicing a combat sport, a martial sport. You've been doing that for a while. You're a brown belt, black belt, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then all of a sudden you go out to some club, guy picks a fight, and he clobbers you with that big ass haymaker that you never ever see in the dojo, because everybody throws crisp and clean punches and kicks. And you end up on the ground, and then he stomps you a little bit more, and his buddies come in and they kick the crap out of you until your friends see what's going on and they pull you off him, and there's this big melee, and you end up with a black eye, broken nose, busted ribs, and you're like, what the hell is that? Nothing that I learned in the dojo worked. You might quit training. You might look at your training in a very different way, or what many people do is you might think, whoa, this doesn't work. What does work? And then you're back to the beginning of the cycle. You're back to discovering what fighting techniques actually work. And you notice that guy threw that big ass haymaker. How does that work, haymakers? Because we never did that in my combat sport. So, okay, let's give it a try, see what happens. And you're in the beginning of the cycle. The reason that I explain all this is When you look at the different stages of the cycle, you start with fighting techniques and it turns into a fighting system. And the martial art is also a system. The combat sport is also a system, but they're all different systems with different priorities, different techniques, different components, different goals, and so on. And I don't think it is wise to assume that the one has more value or less value than the other, but also that a martial art is going to have the exact same goal as a combat sport or a fighting system, and that you can just mix and match those and it's going to be fine. I don't believe that. Like I said, Randy's law, the differences are just as important as the similarities. If you have a system that is geared towards dueling in a sports fighting context, well, maybe that's not the best thing to use if you ever end up in a fight where you have to defend your life in the street and everything's going wrong and the guy has a knife. My whole point is, I think that much of the misunderstanding that you see when it comes to discussions about martial arts and self-defense is that people reason too much with the logic that is inherent in their own system. In their own system. That is the key. If you practice other systems, and if you do so long enough, then you might see that another system has a fundamentally different approach to it. Has different components to training, to teaching, to techniques, and so on. And that isn't necessarily wrong or better or worse than the art that you already practice. But it's seeing how a martial art or self-defense system works as a whole, as a system in and of itself, and how these systems can vary wildly in how they are taught, how they work, and how they are applied. I think there's a lot of value in differentiating between that, because otherwise you fall into that trap of thinking, well, that never works, or that is bullshit, and so on, and you're wasting opportunities to learn something, including your own art. So what I would suggest is take a close look at what you practice and try to map out your style as a system. What are the main components? What are the strategic and the tactical principles? How is it taught? What do you learn? And at which point in time and why? What is expected of you when you reach the higher belts or the higher levels, and so on? If you can do that, you'll probably have a different view of what you learned already, and it will help you learn more of your own style in the future. But most of all, if you understand how one system works, you can look at another art and try to view it as a separate system and look at it with a different point of view and try to understand their point of view. And that way, I think your understanding grows and you can actually learn a whole lot more, not just about the other art, but again, including your own art by contrasting it to a different system, seeing the weaknesses and strength of yours through the eyes of another system and vice versa. That was it. That was a long explanation, but I wanted to cover this because it's something that I've been working on myself for a very long time. I'm going to leave it at that. If you guys have questions or comments, obviously you're more than welcome to it. So once again, go to wimsblog.com/21, so 21, and that'll bring you to the page with the show notes. As always, I want to thank you guys for listening to the show. If you want to help out a little bit, just share it with people that you think might enjoy this. If you want to support the show, patreon.com/Demeere, go there, and I will, failing that, talk to you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.